So, hey guys, welcome to the Adult Fiction Readathon live stream. We're just here to be talking about adult fiction, and I'm here with Jess and Kasha. Do you guys want to say a little bit about yourselves?
Okay, so hi, I'm Jess, and I have a YouTube channel called Read by Jess. I read a complete mix of books, but probably mostly YA and thrillers. And yeah.
Hi, I'm Kasha. My channel is called Kasha in Bookland, and I did read a lot of YA last year, but I'm going back to adult fiction and horror. So yeah, anything that's horror related, you can come to me.
And I'll just also briefly introduce myself. I'm Olivia from Olivia's Catastrophe, and I mostly read a mess of books. But so far this year, it's been non-fiction and adult fiction, pretty much. So how is the readathon going for both of you guys so far?
For me, it's going quite well. Like, I've read 3 of my 7 books, and I just finished My Cousin Rachel by Daphne du Maurier, which I really enjoyed. So I read the really short books first, and now I'm left with A Sense and Sensibility as like my next read, which I'm dreading, but we'll see how that goes.
Hopefully you'll like it.
I'm just having bad luck, so I'm just accepting it and welcoming it. I read The Turning of the Screw because I wanted to get ready for the new movie that just came out and the Netflix show that's going to come out this year. But it was very bad. I just had to use an audiobook because else I would not have finished it. It was boring. And then I went and did some research, and apparently I'm not the only one that had trouble with that book. I'm reading The Ninth House now. Not really enjoying it yet. So we'll see. And the only thing that I'm really enjoying is a anthology of like horror short stories written by women, which is really interesting. And it's called Strange Girls. So yeah, that's one is coming out this month. So if anybody's interested in short stories written by women, and it's all horror stories, it's adult. So yeah, that one's pretty good, at least.
It'll keep being good so that you can have something you enjoy for the readathon.
I don't think you're alone in not liking Ninth House either, because I personally DNF'd it, but I think I've seen a lot of people saying that they also haven't enjoyed it.
Yeah, this is the book that I'm using for the buddy read, and everybody has either DNF'd it or is hating it. And we're a group of like 6 people buddy reading it, and I'm like, this failed. But anyways, I have to finish it for the adultathon, so I'll just sacrifice myself and finish it and not DNF it.
Does it count? Olivia, you can tell us. Does it count? Can we DNF the books?
You can DNF books. I'm not going to force you to keep reading a book you don't like.
She's going to fly over from Australia and come and find you.
Exactly. No, just, you know what, I give it a fair chance because I'm only like 90 pages into the book, and it's like 400 pages, like over 400.
You're so much better than I am.
Give it a fair chance.
Oh, wow.
I read like a page and DNF'd it, so you're definitely giving it a fairer chance than me.
All right. Yeah, I'm having a big problem DNFing stuff because I feel like somebody put so much effort into the book. You know, maybe if I get to halfway through the book, things are gonna turn around. Maybe we'll see. Yeah, I'll give it still a chance.
Yeah, that's always my problem. So just to get us kicking off on discussion, we'll start with probably a difficult one, which is how do you define adult fiction? Where do you think something falls into the adult fiction line or into the young adult line?
I think it depends if we're considering new adult, because my instinct is to say if it's aimed at 18 or above, just like that's what we would consider an adult in most countries. So therefore I would consider that adult fiction. But then if we're considering new adult to be sort of like an 18 to 25-ish area, then I don't know, or maybe new adult goes under adult. So maybe it is adult, but then within that you can have subcategories.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah. I think it's like new adult came like around 10 years ago. Like it's not something that's been always there. So it's kind of in a gray area, like you said. It's kind of like something to try to cover the spacing between young adult and adult, something that was missing, like a lot of stories of people going to college, having their first job, you know, things that were not represented so much. So for me, adult would be, like you said, more like 25 maybe plus. going more into that direction. Yeah.
Like, I agree with that, and that's what like I would think, but then also I'm not 25 yet, so I'm thinking I almost don't class myself as an adult, but I do. So that's like where I have the issue with it, because I'm like, I'm adulting, like I'm not going to class myself as, I don't know, that's where it becomes weird.
Yeah, I feel like new adult is such a tricky genre because back when I started to read new adult, it was just explicit romance. That's what new adult was, just explicit romance. And then at some point, it turned into explicit romance, but they're just starting to get jobs. And then it totally morphed into something else. When I saw it, it was like, oh, young adult grabbed a hold of this side of the adult fiction and ran away with it. But now it's become its own genre that people don't quite know where to put it. I would still put it under adult, I think, but a subcategory, a subgenre of adult, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's where I'm saying with it as well.
Yeah.
And
would you?
Because new adult could change. Like, you're right, you're both saying it's really fresh and really new, and it is ever changing. So it could morph again into something different, and then it might even have a different name, because so many people have problems with calling it new adult, because to a non-bookish person, what's the difference between new and young? And you could get them mixed up. So it's sort of like it could become something else entirely. Therefore, it sort of has to go underneath a bracket. If we have children's, YA, and adult, it can go under adult.
Would you still give it its own space in a bookshop then? Like, would you say that new adult can be its own shelf of books?
I would, because I think there are people who like are looking for those books. Like you say, there's way less books about people in their early 20s or even like mid 20s or late 20s. We sort of seem to go from teenagers to 40-year-old people, and there's not a lot in between. So I feel like for people who are looking for that, people of like our age, it's nice to have that section where you can go. And I don't know why it's just come into my head, but if you've ever read any of like the other Taylor Jenkins Reid books, so I'm thinking of like Forever Interrupted, where the characters I think are 25 or 26-ish. Those books are classed as adult, and you would find them in an adult section. But actually, I would love to have a new adult, or whatever you want to call it, section with books like that in.
Yeah, I think I would like that as well. Like, it depends also on the mood that where you want to read. We have everything categorized anyway, so why not bring that as well on the bookstore? You know, it might help a lot of people that are specifically looking for that. Yeah.
And also, would you say that every genre has new adult? Because when I see new adult, I'm typically thinking of contemporary as a genre. But does horror have a new adult? Does, I don't know, science fiction have a new adult?
I don't think horror does. Like, most of the books that I have read are either spooky, like middle grade books, or YA horror that are not quite there where the horror genre is. Like, they're trying to be horror, but it's not really creepy enough for me, at least. And then we have the real horror where it's all out. You know, like, I don't think there is anything like of 20-year-old people. It's mostly either teenagers or adults. So I think it would be cool if we have like some authors that would explore a little bit more that gray area that's there in between, and we would have new adult horror books.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel like there could be a great horror story where it's like starting a new job and then it turns out to be a horror.
Oh, well, that makes me think of, if you've read Lock Every Door by Riley Sager.
No, but I bought it because I read The Last Time I Lied, I think it's called, right? Yeah, and I really enjoyed that one, so I did buy Lock Every Door. So
Lock Every Door is better.
Yeah,
it's nice. Even better. And I think she is mid-20s, and she gets a new job, and then it gets very creepy. And I don't know if I would call it horror.
She's the one that's like sitting in an apartment.
Yeah, that's her job. I don't know if I would call it horror, because I don't read horror that much, so I don't really know how I would define that, but I found it very spooky. Like, after reading that, being home alone was difficult.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, he writes thrillers, but the line sometimes between thriller and horror is a little bit thin.
Oh yeah, that's a whole other
thing. Yeah. So it depends, but I still consider it thriller. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like when does it become a horror or a thriller, or who even knows? But I would say that about the whether or not we have different genres in new adult, I think no, but and you were saying about if only more authors would explore it, and I think lots of authors are exploring it, mostly like debuts, but they're just not getting the book deals because it's not a tried and tested formula. So like a agent or a publisher is going to be like, well, new adult doesn't sell because traditionally new adult like doesn't sell in that way that YA and adult does. Like it does sell commercially and it is a business, but not in that traditional, you could go to the supermarket and buy it. It's going to be on the table in Waterstones or whatever your main bookshop is. And because it's got that sort of bad reputation of being romance / erotica, it needs a little bit of an overhaul, I think, like a rebrand, like just start again and you can have this whole other section, but everyone's too afraid to do it. And no one wants to take that risk because what if it fails? It's an investment and so on. So I think that's the problem. Publishers can only take on a limited amount of books, and then why are they going to take a risk when they could publish the same thing with a similar title? Let's just fill in the blanks of this traditional title, slap a snake on it, off we go.
Yeah, and I think there's a problem with that because a lot of new adult books are being classified as young adult, and that brings me to the question of what age is a good age for them to start bridging into adult, if you want to say that there has to be an age.
Oh, that's difficult.
I don't think there is an age. Like, I don't know if you guys know this. I mentioned this in my channel a couple of times, but I went from middle grade to Stephen King. So I didn't have anything in between. And basically started reading YA when I was older. And I was like, oh, you know, I found BookTube and everybody is talking mostly about YA literature. It's not so much about adult as you would think. And so I started discovering all of these YA books that I had missed or new ones, and I started exploring then YA, but I went straight from middle grade sort of to Stephen King, you know, apart from reading the classics that you read in school and high school and stuff. And so did it make me weird? Maybe. But I think that, you know, people are really scared of teenagers reading adult books. Mostly for the typical things, you know, like sex and violence. Oh my God, sex and violence, you know. But I think that it's just, you know, people want to protect their children from reality. That's the way life is, you know. And I think there are some specific topics that are trigger warnings that I think in any kind of books, you know, middle grade YA, new adult or adult, there has to be trigger warnings at the beginning of the book or at the end in the last page for the people that want to check that because they can be triggered. So I think it's more of a thing of, are there trigger warnings in this book that it's adult that might be too harsh for like a teenager more than the teenagers reading adult books? I don't think that's the, you know, that's so bad, if you know what I mean.
I do remember when I was younger as well, I was just jumping all over the place, kind of like I do now. Like I remember reading Twilight and then reading The Kite Runner and then going back to something teenage and then reading Jane Eyre, and I was just flicking between the two. And I feel like it didn't, like the fact that my reading wasn't policed was really good. But I wonder if, I mean, could I have read something that would be too much for me and then I'd be like, I don't know. It was weird.
Yeah, I don't think that I would have been harmed personally by reading something too old for me. Like my reading jumped around a lot as well, and I think I read The Kite Runner at quite a young age, and obviously that's got a very horrifying scene in it. And I think it just depends on the person more so. Like you can't put like an age rating out for everybody because as well, everybody who grows up in a different way. You'll have young people growing up in a very sheltered environment where they might get to 16 and think that swearing and violence is awful, and you know they're very, very innocent about what happens in the world. And then you'll have teenagers that have seen more than most adults, so you really can't put it on the same playing field because everybody's life experience kind of makes them mature in a different way. I think that I would just think that you would, like you say, have some kind of guidance, maybe not put an age, but put some themes. I think American books tend to do this more than UK books, where they'll have on the copyright page a synopsis of the book and like a detailed, like it spoils the book essentially, and it's in small print. So that I guess a parent, if a parent wants to get involved, or if somebody's thinking, I just want to check that before I read it, like, or having those trigger warnings in place, it gives you the autonomy and you can make a personal decision about that, or have somebody else check it. If you don't want the spoilers, you could say, read this and just tell me if you think I'll be okay with the book. And then that way you can make that decision. And I know it's difficult because young people tend to not go, oh, this is too much for me, therefore I won't read it. But what else can we do? Like putting a one age fits all on it is not the way to go, I don't think.
Yeah, Ola did say that I think putting reality into boxes is sad. I wish publishers would cut the age category thing and learn to give proper trigger warnings. And I think that sounds like a pretty good idea. And then we have the question of who puts the trigger warning? Is it the author, the publisher, or should the audience do it? Because BookTube seems to be starting to just put trigger warnings, like in the description box down below, they've started to put trigger warnings because the publishing industry or the authors are not doing it. So
well, it would be the responsibility of the publisher because they make the product. So, you know, it's their job to market it. It's their job. Like, you know, the author's job is literally just to write it. It's the publisher's job to do everything else. So
it's like the movies, you're supposed to give it a rating, you know, you're not asking the audience later after they watch the movie, do you think it's 13 or not?
It's
you
too
know,
late
like,
for an audience.
Tell them.
You need to, you can't be the audience, and the author does not have that responsibility, and they're too close to their own work to be able to do that. I think it would have to be a publisher. And I think, sorry, going back to that first point about the age boxes as well, I think that more happens in children's fiction, and like, you know, with the whole 9 to 12 and or 8 to 12, and everybody does it differently, and there's no consistency at all. That needs to stop as well, because that just like when I had like a mini rant in my brain when I saw that, because it's so true, and kids hate that, and it can be like, oh, this book's too old for me or too young for me, or you can't read that because it's not your age, and it's just stupid. I can see why it's done, because it helps the adults make decisions. It helps you go, oh, that's right for my child, or that's right for this part of my bookshop. Like a bookseller who doesn't want to read every book can easily know where to put it. But I just think that the age boxes need to go. Sorry, that had to happen.
And going back to another question, what would you say is the major difference between adult content and young adult content? What are these differences that you see in how they're written, in what they're about, themes? Well, we already talked a bit about what they're about, but different themes and topics.
I think there's one main thing, but I want to hear what you guys say first. I want to see if we have the same idea.
I think it's more like in the present. It's a little bit more like things are happening now. Adult is a little bit more reflecting, you know, a little bit more, it's a different kind of writing, but the topics might be exactly the same. Honestly, it's just the way they're handled, it's different. And the way that, you know, adult has more descriptions, more graphics, and, you know, when it comes to violence or sex scenes, that in YA books, there is sex or there is violence, but it's not as shocking and as described, and, you know, it doesn't have all these graphics in your head as adult books would go really into it. So that's for me one of the biggest difference.
Going off of what you just said, it kind of brings into the question of teen versions of adult books, because I know with The Tattooist of Auschwitz by Heather Morris, they released a teenage version, which is still nonfiction. And actually the only thing they changed about it was the cover, just so that the cover was reaching to different people, but they kept all of the same content in, even though it's set in Auschwitz. And then I know that they did one for I Am Malala, but I haven't read the teenage version, so I can't say what they included in it and what they didn't include in it. But I feel like when it comes to darker themes, teenagers pretty much can take it. And I feel like especially older teens can take it and process it. But there are like things that are really dark, like sexual assault, but there are younger children who do get sexually assaulted, and then there's grief, but there are younger children who lose parents and family members. So I feel like it's not necessarily the theme. I feel like mostly, personally, what I would say is how the characters react changes depending on the age audience.
What do you mean by that?
I feel like if I'm going to take grief, because I read a lot of books about grief, so that's always my like point. If I read a middle grade, the children don't know how to process those emotions yet, and they kind of end up lashing out and such. And then in teenage fiction, they might understand how to handle it a bit better, and think about it a bit more, but they still have certain lashing out. They still make some decisions that I wouldn't make, but as a teenager, I feel like it's very sensible that that character makes it. But then as an adult dealing with grief, a lot of the time it's very they continue about living normally, but they're thinking a lot and they're kind of not in the right headspace. So I feel like the way that these themes are handled differs depending on the age audience, but it's not actually the theme itself that needs to be different, if that makes sense.
That's interesting, because I would say as well, like my answer was going to be that it's the age of the protagonist mostly. I know it's not a blanket rule, because you'll get adult books that are sort of from the perspective of like an 11-year-old child or whatever, but like YA, you've got a teenager's perspective like 99.999% of the time. Can you name a YA book from an adult's perspective? Because I don't think I can. And then adult books, like you might get the occasional book written for adults that takes a child's perspective, but very rarely a teenager's perspective. So that's interesting. So I would say it's the age of the protagonist, like, because as well, when you pick up a book, I think a lot of people want to relate to the protagonist in some way, even if it's just the way that they think, or getting into their, like, even if they're completely different people, like something happens and the protagonist reacts and it's like, oh, I would react like that, you know, like any kind of form of, you can link yourself to that protagonist, that's what you like. So authors tend to, I guess, go for somebody of the age group of their targeted audience.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Looking at this chat now, I can see some good questions.
Let's see.
I like that question. There's a question from Book Casey. What kind of standards should we have for trigger warnings? Graphic can be kind of subjective. Do you think the movie industry has useful ratings? I think that's a good question.
I haven't seen good movie trigger warnings. I feel like mostly with films, they just have the age on them, as far as I can see.
I think that's what she means, though. I think she means, like, do you think the movie industry has useful ratings?
I wouldn't say they're useful. I feel like when I go and watch a film, if I do want to check the triggers, I know my younger sister does this. There's this website called doesthedogdie.com, and you can put in a film, and other people have added trigger warnings there, so you can see detailed triggers before you go and see a film. And I still feel like there needs to be more triggers and more specific triggers. I've started to try and make my own triggers more specific, because I've realized that for some people you can say like, oh, my trigger is suicide, but then it can be more particular. It can be the how that is the trigger. So it's really hard to be particular, but you kind of need to be.
Yeah, but then there's that thing of, like, if you're so specific, some people want a trigger but not a spoiler, and then that's really difficult because they just want to see graphic and then they can sort of make a judgment, or they just want to see violence and then they can sort of make a judgment. But for other people, they'll want, like you say, a very specific answer. So you're never going to please everybody. I think having somewhere, like you said, like a website like that you can go to that gives you a specific thing is great, because then you can really see it. And if we had something like that for books, that would be amazing. And then maybe in the book, we have like trigger warnings that are in the middle. Like graphic is too vague, but then, like, say the method of suicide might be very specific. So maybe somewhere in the middle of that.
And just to promote Does the Dog Do Some Books, it really is just everything that people have managed to put on there. So it's basically like Wikipedia grows by itself.
Using it.
I should check it out. I'm always mad when they kill an animal in a book. It really upsets me. I don't care if humans are killed. It's fine with me. But you know, when you're reading a book and the cat dies, I'm like, nope. Somebody should have told me the cat dies. Just because, you know, I'm a cat lover and stuff. So the trigger warnings can be so particular and so personal that it's sometimes really hard, because then every book would have like 3 pages of trigger warnings, like, you know. So of course there are more important ones, like you said, you know, suicide or sexual assault, where really, you know, we have victims that have trauma, and when they read these things they get triggered again and they relieve it, and it's kind of like a post-traumatic thing, and that should be avoided. So I think having like somewhere at the beginning or at the end a list of those more like harder topics, so that people can protect themselves before they even buy the book, that will be really beneficial for everybody.
Yeah, and I think as well, some things that trigger people aren't things that you would think of. So like they might seem to other people like, how is that a trigger? Or they might be too, do you know what I mean? Like something very strange, and then they're going to get triggered anyway. And I think it's this issue that, like, it's almost unsolvable to a point, but we need to do everything we can.
Yeah. I did have that experience because I read a book where the dog does die, I won't say which book, and I put all my triggers, and then someone replied to my Instagram story, oh, but does the dog die in this one? And I was like, wow, that's a trigger for people. It's actually quite a common trigger, but because I am not a person with pets, I didn't think about it at all until somebody asked me the direct question. So it can be really hard to cover all your bases, know what needs to be included.
Yeah, especially things that are even more like weird than that. So like you know, for instance, I'm just going to give like personal example here. I think it was The Fault in Our Stars, like when I first read that, and Augustus has like this moment where he talks about like how he views the universe and like us all being nothing and like all of that stuff. Like, how would you even classify that little monologue? I don't know. I found that very triggering. But you can't, like, how do you describe that? Monologue about existentialism, like, you know, pretentious teen is going to talk about this for 2 pages. You can't put that on a book, but at the same time, like, it might trigger people. I'm pretty sure I'm not the only person that found that difficult, but like, how on earth do you put like conversation as a trigger?
Yeah, it's so hard. Okay, moving on to a lighter topic. Do we think adult fiction needs to be updated with their covers? Do they need to get more beautiful covers as well, just like young adult?
Oh my gosh, that just reminded me of, you know, you said about Tattooist of Auschwitz. Was that the book you were talking about?
Yeah.
That got a different cover for a YA version. I think that is more common than people talk about, because like, for instance, like when I worked in publishing, we did a lot of taking classics and changing the covers. So like Anne of Green Gables with like children's covers, because it's technically a children's book, even though most of the adults read it. And then like the Jane Austen editions that I've been reading for Austen and On, like those are the Sweet Cherry editions where they redid the covers. So like taking and they redid them for a YA audience. Like that was the target. That was what we were discussing. So I think they're a little bit younger than that, but like that was the whole idea, is taking adult classics and give the ones that could be accessible to younger people and then changing the covers. So like, I think that's an interesting thing that does happen a lot. Sorry, tangent, but you just reminded me by talking about covers.
No, that's really interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that happened so much. I did see it for classics, but I didn't know that it could happen for other books as well.
I guess because classics, like, you know, it's, well, okay, so the reason it would be classics is because they're out of copyright, so you can publish it and it doesn't matter what publisher you are. Like, whereas another book, it would have to be you as the publisher, the only publisher makes that decision. I guess like Harry Potter's sort of done that. There are Harry Potter editions more aimed at adults and more aimed at children.
Yeah, there is this adult version. I found it a little bit boring, to be honest. The adult editions of Harry Potter. I just think people are scared, I think, to publish adult books with more younger or children appealing covers, because people are going to get confused, or because they're going to think that's for children or not mature enough or something like that. But I don't think it has anything to do with the content of the book. And nowadays, the horror books that are being released, most of them have also more like simple covers. And if you go back to the 70s and the 80s, all of those like old school horror books, they had amazing covers. And I don't know why things are changing more towards minimalism. You know what I mean? It's just like a title, a picture of some woods in the background. There we go. We have our cover. You know, like there's not so much imagination put into covers for some adult books anymore. And I think it's a pity. You know, it's there are so many good graphic artists out there that could, you know, make these awesome covers. But I think they're scared of, will adults buy these books or not? You know, if we make them with so much graphics and colors and things, you know, and creatures and whatever. Yeah,
definitely.
Like, that leads right back to the new adult discussion, because books like Nevernight, Ninth House, as you said, these ones keep getting classified as young adult. And I have to admit, if I just looked at the book, I'd be like, oh look, that's a young adult book and not an adult book. But it is adult, and they've said it's adult. Also, the Poppy War, I think, has the same issue.
Yeah. Same. Yeah. That is interesting, and I guess it's because we don't really have a new adult category, that we don't know what new adult covers look like, other than the romance ones. So
Yeah.
like we need to have a little bit of a revolution, I think. Someone needs to be gutsy in the publishing industry and just go for it, which is easily said when I'm not the one who would put my money on the line. But I think if they did that, then we would one day know, oh, that's a new adult book, like, or whatever you call it. That's a book aimed at people in their 20s.
And I have to admit that actually one of my problems with some adult fiction genres is that the covers all look the same. Like adult romance and especially thrillers, like I can't pick up a thriller and know that this is going to be like, I know you shouldn't judge a book by a cover, but because they all look the same, I'm like, how do I tell you apart?
Oh, and they're all called the same thing as well. Like, like the woman liar or liar.
The words "she" are there. The word "you" are there.
Yeah.
Lost, like all of these. It's everywhere.
And they've all got like dark blue-ish color covers. And to be honest, if you read them, most of them are the same. So I'm like, I've found reading thrillers for the past year very difficult because literally they are the same thing. Someone has been a very big thriller reader, gone, I'm gonna write a thriller, written the same thing, and it's just getting published because that book is just like Girl on the Train, and look how well that did. And
Germany is like everybody's nuts for thrillers, not just books, also like movies and television. Here is like a big thing. It has a huge market, so here everybody reads thrillers. But I agree with you that most of the plots and the twists and everything, you already see it coming because you've read it 1,000 times before, and it's hard to find a good thriller. So hard, and I don't get surprised anymore.
Well, yeah, and my issue is with the characters as well. Like I said earlier about how we have that jump to like 40-year-old characters, and what I wanted to say was 40-year-old women who feel miserable, because that is all we get in thrillers, and it drives me. If I start reading, if I know a book is just about 40-year-old woman, maybe her husband's cheating on her, or she's single and alone and so miserable because basically she doesn't have any relationship fulfillment, and then everyone thinks that she's crazy and there's loads of gaslighting. That is so irritating. Can't stand it anymore. And I think that's why I loved Lock Every Door so much, because it had that refreshing style of a young character who was just starting out and like needed the money of a job and was navigating a new city, and like all of that was so exciting to read about, so many possibilities in life, rather than reading about someone who's like, I have no possibilities, my life is rubbish. Like I can't read that. And the thing is, we do like to read the same stories over and over again. That whole thing of there being only like 7 stories and fundamentally everything was back to the same traditions, and I get that, but they need to be refreshing and interesting enough. And there's just not that balance in the thriller world. And I'm so bored of paranoid women.
Yeah. It happens a lot. I
read a good thriller, though, in December. That was No Exit. So if anybody's looking for a good thriller.
Who's that by again? I can picture it.
Taylor. Hold on.
I'm going to Google it. It's got a blue cover, right?
Taylor Adams. Yeah, by Taylor Adams. That was one that it was a little bit different. It was way darker than I expected, and it's not following any of these typical patterns of thrillers, like scenarios. So I kind of really enjoyed that one because it was a bit different from the ones that I had read before. So, and it's kind of in winter. Huh?
What was it about?
It's this girl that it's driving back home in this snowstorm because her mom is really sick, so she wants to go to her mom. But because of the snowstorm, she has to stop at this kind of like a pit stop station, like somewhere where she can stop. And there are 4 other strangers in there, and they're all kind of waiting for, the police to come and clear kind of the area so they can drive back. And while they're there, she discovers that in the parking lot, there is a van, and inside there is a kid in a cage. And she doesn't know who the van belongs to. Why is this kid kept captive in this van? And so she goes back inside where the strangers are, and she tries to figure out who owns the van. Why is this girl there? So I thought it was really interesting because it's not the typical, murder scenario or like
that
typical
sounds amazing.
thriller. It was kind of different, and I thought, and it's basically one of those like scenarios where you're in the same place the whole book. So it's kind of like very atmospheric, and you're like trapped there with her trying to figure out who did this.
That's making me think of The Seven Deaths of Evelyn Hardcastle, because it's that thing of like you don't know who you can trust and trying to figure out stuff through like conversations and
exactly.
Yeah. Okay,
That's what I
like
really liked about that one, because it was kind of different. Yeah,
that's cool.
So, speaking of being turned off of genres and such, what do you think brings so many adults to reading young adult? Because as we can see from the booktube community, a lot of adults do read young adult. And going that way, rather than talking about young adults, can they read adult? How do we feel? Like, what brings you to young adult? Because I think we're all adults here. And is it because something's lacking in adult fiction, or is there just something good about young adult?
I guess it's the closest thing we can get to a good new adult category, isn't it? Like reading books about 17-year-olds, is closer than reading a book about 40-year-olds. Like I'm closer to 17 than I am to 40. So maybe
I'm the other way around. So for me, I'm closer to 40 than to 70. And for me, the reason of reading YA was I completely missed on the genre. The only thing I read was Twilight years ago, before it was even a movie. I was just in a bookstore. I was looking through books and I saw, a book about vampires. I'm going to buy that because I really love vampires since I was a kid. And one of my first horror movies was Dracula by Coppola. So for me, like vampires have always been something I want to read about. So I picked up Twilight and I read it and I was like, oh, that's okay. It was fine. I picked up the second book and I was like, and then it just went worse and worse, but I didn't even know that it was YA. I just picked the book because it was there. It was about vampires. So because I went, I guess, from reading middle grade to adult, for me, this YA section didn't exist. I didn't know what booktube was back then. So I didn't know there was this thing called YA that was supposed to be books for teenagers. So I was just reading whatever I pleased. But when I found booktube, I was like, oh, I completely missed on this. So I started kind of catching up and reading all of these things, the Hunger Games, the Lunar Chronicles. I need to read all of these things because I missed them. And for me, it's just like revisiting a little bit more imagination, because the whole like world building in YA is so different from the adult fantasies, because they're so serious and they're more like, I don't know, violent and serious. And then you have the YA fantasy that it's more about all of these fantastic worlds and creatures and things. And it's a little bit different. So I think it triggers your imagination in another way. So I think that's why I have been enjoying reading some YA as well as adult books. Yeah.
That's such an interesting way of looking at it, especially from like a fantasy perspective. As someone who doesn't read a lot of fantasy, like that's really interesting to hear. I think that I had a similar experience in that I don't really remember what YA I read before Twilight. Like I know I was reading, but I think I was in danger of not reading anymore because I was like had that sort of like path where I was reading lots of like Jacqueline Wilson and like the kind of older children's fiction, and getting into that gap where it would have been like a danger zone where lots of people stopped reading. And around that time, I think Twilight came out, and then that linked me onto reading lots of other like YA fantasy things like L.J. Smith's books and so on. And like it's interesting because like I didn't know it was YA when I was reading it either, just because I was so young. I wasn't thinking about this is children's, this is YA. And I didn't, I wasn't on Twitter, so like I had no idea that this was a whole category. But it just sort of happened by accident. And I think I don't hate Twilight. I actually quite like Twilight, and I'm very thankful that it's brought so many people into YA. Like I personally, I think read YA because I'm closer to that age group than adult. I think I like it because of that, but also because it's got that excitement of like possibilities and things that can happen. It's very dramatic, and I really enjoy that. And the characters tend to be a little bit more like, my life could go in any direction, whereas the adults feel very limited a lot of the time. Like that's a huge generalization, but something that I notice a lot, and especially YA romance, which I'm an absolute sucker for if it's done well, because I know so many people get frustrated by YA romance and like, oh, I don't get it because it's feeding an unhealthy idea that they're going to end up with their boyfriend when they're a teenager, and it's unrealistic and it's stupid. And I'm like, I love romance, and I ended up marrying my boyfriend when I was like, that I met when I was 16, 17. And so like, you know, for me, it happened. It's possible. Therefore, I can read these books and I can believe in those relationships and I can believe they will last because I've been through that. So I can go into it and like really swoon. And so I enjoy it because of that.
Yeah. So I feel like Twilight's been pivotal in so many people's reading. Like whether you like it or not, whether you agree that it's problematic or not, I feel like we universally agree that it's problematic. But it's just been such a marker. I think it was the first young adult that I read as well. I mainly read it. So yeah. And now I have to ask a question about whether explicit scenes make something adult, or is there a type of explicit that makes it adult?
What do you think?
I think that explicit scenes doesn't necessarily make it adult. It can make it mature teen. And I feel like we see a bit more in young adult romance, like first time encounters. And then that is kind of easing teenagers into more explicit scenes that come. In fantasy, there's the young adult, new adult discussion going on again. I feel like with the Court of Thorns and Roses and with some other ones where there are very explicit romance scenes, and some parents aren't happy with that, with their teenagers reading it, and then some people are putting it as new adult. So it's kind of in the mixed stage again.
I mean, I think teenagers should read about these things as long as it's done, you know, respectfully, as long as it's not something horrible. I don't think it's bad that they read these things because they're going to do it anyways. They're going to do it eventually. They're going to have their own experiences. So why not read about positive experiences in books, you know, like about sexual encounters? Why not? But yeah, if there's something like sexual assault, it should be as a trigger warning, but just regular relationships leading to a sexual encounter, why not? Like teenagers nowadays are, you know, doing it when they're still really young, and parents don't talk to them most of the time about it. So I don't think it's wrong if they discover this kind of things through books, as long as it's done properly. For me, I don't think we should protect them so much about their own bodies and sexual encounters and things like that. It's life. It happens, you know, like it's better if they know about it than if they don't know anything about it, for me.
I agree with you, but I'm going to play devil's advocate a little bit because there are places in the world where, say, like the age of consent is 18. And so if it's a YA novel and we're saying it's mature YA or whatever, potentially the age of consent might be higher. And so should they be reading about it beforehand? Also, like in terms of their culture and how they grow up, like, you know, countries around the world where there are quite innocent young people who maybe don't want to like engage in things like that before marriage, or like it's like they personally have those beliefs and they might not want that. And like, so I think there's definitely that to consider. Like I completely agree that I think it should be explored, but I've met young people. So like, for instance, I'll give you an example. I met a young person who had read The Hate You Give. I think she was 13 or 14. And this, like, I don't know exactly where she was from, but wasn't a Western country. And so she said, I said, did you enjoy it? She said, yeah. And I was like, well, it was a really important book. Like, what did you think about it? And she said, oh, it was good, but there was too much swearing in it. And, you know, this was someone like living not in a Western country, has not had Western values, and they didn't want to see swearing in The Hate You Give. Yeah. So like we have to take that into account as well. Like there are young people who don't want to have those things. So I don't know. I think we do need to consider it, because I also like to recommend books to my mom. I try and recommend young adult books. I actually recommended The Hate You Give to her and she read it. But it's always difficult because my mom doesn't actually swear at all, and she doesn't like reading excessive, or not excessive, but a lot of swearing. So it's always hard to, because I don't really notice it too much in books anymore. So it's always hard to be like, was there swearing in that? And I feel like it brings into the discussion of adults aging up young adult, because apparently by so many adults reading young adult, publishers are starting to cater towards that a bit more, and they have aged up the genre. There seems to be a bigger gap appearing between middle grade and upper young adult, and there's not really books that seem to cater specifically to, like, we're putting age into boxes again, but 12 to 15. I knew you were going to say that. Like, but
that
my
gap seems to be there.
Is, what would you call that? Because in my head, I go, children's, middle grade, teen, YA, adult? Like, how do you refer to it?
I always say young adult and I skip teen.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe I need to put teen in there because, I mean, they're there, they exist. And yeah, we have to cater towards all age audiences, I think, to all ages and to all stages of life. And I do think I feel like because there's so many books being written and so many books being published, why can't we just like cater to it all? Why can't we have books without swearing? Why can't we have books?
Because some sell more than others and people just want to make more money. So they're like, oh, this thriller sold like loads of copies. We made a lot of money off that. Let's do that again. Like, let's not do something risky. Do the thing that works. Do the formula. Do this. Do the boxes. Put the word lie in it, and we'll make millions. Like, I'm exaggerating, but that tends to be how it works. So it's really difficult to do something different, and no one wants to be the first person to do it. I wish the bigger publishing houses would do it though. Like, I think like Penguin, like for instance, you can afford to take some risks if you're Penguin.
Yeah, and once you take risks, they often go well. Like, you have a book that's always the first one to do something. Twilight seemed to be the first one to do vampire romance. The Hate You Give seemed to be the first one. I'm just saying that I could be wrong. That blew up, that did police brutality. And then there seems to be a string of them follow after. So we can see that there's these successes for new things that we try.
Yeah.
And yet there's not enough new things that get tried.
Exactly. I completely agree with that. And I think people aren't considering the fact that they could be the people that published the book like Twilight or The Hate You Give or The Girl on the Train or Gone Girl. They could be those, like The Fault in Our Stars, those books that are on those lists of like, you have to read this in your lifetime, and they've sold millions of copies. Like, those books, they could have them. And they normally come from risks, you know? So like even Harry Potter was a bit of a risk, and Twilight was a bit of a risk. I remember Girl on the Train came around when thrillers were not, like, thrillers were more aimed at men, and it just turned that thriller genre towards women completely. And now we've almost got a separation where we've got like men's thrillers and women's thrillers, to be really horrible about it. But that's how it seems to be now. So they should do it.
So have we got any more thoughts? Otherwise we might go to some favorite adult fiction that we just want to recommend to close off. Anything more you guys want to say?
I guess I might just start talking about new adult. I think we need a name for it, but if anyone can come up with a name for it, like, that would be great, because then like booktubers have influence, and in our videos we could start referring to it by a name that we come up with, and we could use that and say this book was new adult, or whatever we're going to call it, and start a trend. And I think it doesn't necessarily have to come from the top, and in a lot of cases and scenarios in society we always look to the people at the top to make the change, but actually the consumers have a lot of power, and if we start doing that, bookshops will start making sections for it, and if you know what I mean, and so on and so on, and we can go the other way. So
it's like that in every like product or market. Once the people that demand that start to go up, then we're gonna get what we want. Because the problem is they don't know how many people want this, so they're like, yeah, well, let's not risk it. But if people start demanding something, then there's going to be a market, and they know it, and then they're going to put effort into it.
I think I'm personally going to make a bit more effort when I am talking about books, like say in wrap-ups, and I know the characters are in their 20s, to refer to that as new adult until like a better name is thought of, and then that way I can say like, these are the YA books I read, these are the new adult books I read, and people will go, oh, I didn't realize that was new adult, I thought it was like older people, and hopefully start creating those distinctions myself when I'm talking about books that I haven't been doing before. And then that I would like that to become more of a, like, little old me isn't going to make that change, but if more people did that, then
this is a call to action.
Yeah, it's a call to action. Everyone should start making the distinction, just because when you recommend it, then it is more helpful. Like if somebody said in a wrap-up, this was a new adult book, okay, without the connotations of that, like, let's put that to one side for a second. If they said that, I would instantly be intrigued, because there aren't enough books in that age group, and I want to read more books about people my age. So I'm instantly going to be more interested, and your recommendation is instantly so much more helpful.
Yeah. Before we go to the recommendations, I was watching somebody's video the other day, and she reads only classics. And I know you guys read classics as well, but I know a lot of people feel intimidated and feel like, oh, it's too much. And honestly, at least where I come from in Spain, in school and high school, you only read classics. There is no YA books that are being given to study in literature class or anything. It's just classics. So, and this person was saying, like, of course, if you're a teenager, you're not going to understand maybe the whole book, but you're going to understand it your own way. You're going to come to your own conclusions. It's going to make you think. It's going to make you kind of mature in a way. And if you read it later, probably you're going to understand it in a totally different way. But I think it's healthy for teenagers, if they're interested, on checking some classics, even if they don't understand the whole intention of the author, but they will understand things their own way. And I think it kind of pushes us a little bit to think more, because, you know, those are kind of harder to grasp. Things like topics, everything was a little bit more masked because they were not allowed to say certain things so direct as we can say them right now. Back then, especially, you know, if you were a woman writing a classic, because there was a lot of, you know, people, it was not nice to women back then when you wanted to write a book. And Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein when she was 18, and the character, even though it's a classic, it touches a lot of like teenager topics, you know, like he's scared, he doesn't understand anything, like it's kind of like a coming of age story but with a monster, which sounds
with
really
obsession
weird.
with beauty and everything.
Yeah, so it's kind of like, yeah, he doesn't like himself, he doesn't understand. And, you know, classics sometimes can be so relatable if people give them a chance. I think there is like this fear of grabbing classics. They might not all be for you. I also read some classics that I was like, no, I cannot deal with this. But there are others that I find that if you read them nowadays, they're still like so relatable. And I think also Dracula has aged really well. If you read it right now, it's not so dry as others. And I think it's also a nice classic to check out. So yeah, I just wanted to mention that because it's also adult fiction.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's interesting. I have issues with classics. Like maybe I've given off the impression that I read a lot of classics because I'm doing so a bit more this year, but I have issues. It's like it's a whole other thing. But
okay.
I think that it's interesting that you say that like you're relating classics to adult fiction because, like, for instance, doing Austen and on, when I read Northanger Abbey and I went to put it on my Goodreads, I didn't know whether to put it as young adult or adult because I genuinely think it probably sits in new adult, and I really didn't know.
I think it does.
I put it as adult, but I think I'm in the minority, and like when it says the most popular ways that people have categorized it, young adult was in there. So when I'm saying like I'm reading Sense and Sensibility, I feel like, am I allowed to read that for adultathon? I don't actually know because the main character's 19. Like, I don't know if that counts, but I'm going to go with it because I'm going to say that new adult is under adult in my life now. So, you know, it's just a weird one that you associate it that way. Like Anne of Green Gables is a classic, and it's a children's book. And if we go classics more in terms of like, you know, like the Odyssey and all of that stuff, like we go way back and we go towards like more like fairy tales and traditional stories. Like you get a lot of children's stories, like not the Odyssey, but you know what I mean? Like if we go back to like Varna.
I mean, fairy tales are classics and they are written for children. And
exactly.
I think in my children's literature class we did A Little Princess, The Secret Garden, The Outsiders, and they're all classics, but they are for children. So
yeah, and I think that's the distinction that you know, young adults, yes, they can read adult classics, but there are children's classics as well. And you know, you said Mary Shelley wrote Frankenstein at 18, and I think an 18-year-old today could read it and get as much, if not more, out of it than like say me. And I'm not really into classics that much because like it just depends on who you are as a person and what you like reading as to what you're going to get out of it. I feel like sometimes we unfairly say like, oh, you're a teenager, so you won't understand this. But
yeah, exactly.
There are a lot of adults out there.
And that's what teenagers hate when you tell them that.
Yeah. But you know, like there are adults out there who don't read, and the teenager who does read is going to get more out of Frankenstein than an adult who never reads. So like,
true.
Yeah, there is that to go with it as well. I think like classics as a whole, another thing. Like,
Yeah. I
it's
think
like
I think
live show.
classic adult, because even the children's book, like one of my favorites is Alice in Wonderland. But when I read it, I'm like, is this really for children? You know what I mean? Like, it's so dark, and I'm like, so I always associate kind of children classics a little bit more pushed to the adult, because I think it's happened with a lot of things that we are getting things for children more and more simple with time. I'm talking like TV shows, things like that. I used to watch shows that are considered more like for teenagers or adults, you know what I mean? Like, and shows for children right now are so made so much simpler than they used to be. And I think I have the same thing with children's books. I think back then they were a lot more dense, and like Anne of Green Gables and all of these, I've enjoyed all of those books. But if I read those and then I read children's books that has been written in the last decade, I'm like, whoa, there's a lot of difference here, you know? So that's why I always tend to think of children's classics more of an adult kind of book.
Yeah, I think that's partly in terms of like what time we live in, and like at the time, it's always hard to imagine, but I always think like, for instance, at the time, like when Jane Austen was writing, did people find her books more accessible or engaging? Like, whereas everyone like, oh, this is written so simply, like at the time, but now we don't see it that way. Like I always like to think of it that way. And I think as well, there's been more of a push towards accessibility, because books traditionally were for like the educated people, and so now, like with that simplicity that you're talking about, I think it's more to do with like accessibility, so that like if they want more kids to read, they want more kids to consume their media for money reasons, like TV shows, we want more viewers, we'll make it simpler so that everybody can access it and not just the people who are smart enough. Then like that's probably why, but then it also does limit us, because do we not want to be talking about like maybe more advanced stuff? But yeah, I think that's probably why it's gone down that route. That's my theory anyway.
That's it's pretty solid. So shall we wrap up with sharing some of our favorites? You can recommend one or two, because like adult fiction's really general. I'm going to choose one genre to help specify, but
okay.
Any favorites to share?
I'll go first then. I have I'm just going to give you like my two favorite books are adult books anyway. And when I think about, like, I do read a lot of YA, and then I come to look at my favorite books and I'm like, wait, do I though? Because the favorites seem to be adult books here. So like my old answer for like what would be my favorite book of all time was 1,000 Splendid Suns by Khaled Hosseini. And you know, this is a book about issues in Afghanistan and women's rights, and it's absolutely heartbreaking and has a ton of trigger warnings that I would highly recommend people look at beforehand, because oh god. But I loved it because of its discussion on women and women coming together, and it's part of history that I didn't know too much about, and it's sort of like more recent history and it's still very relevant. So I found it very impactful. And then my current answer of like what is my favorite book of all time is also an adult book, and it's also a thriller, and I feel like, Kasia, please read it. It's called The Truth About the Harry Quebert Affair by Joel Dicker, who's like one of my favorite authors of all time. It's a 600-page thriller about a man who is like, he wants to be a writer, he's an aspiring author, and he looks up to this successful author called Harry Quebert. And this girl went missing like 15 years ago or something, and then like in the current day, her body is found in Harry Quebert's garden, buried. And so everyone thinks that this famous author must have killed her, and it's all about what actually happened, and it is incredible.
Nice. It sounds like Stephen King, so I'm down for it, because he always likes to write about writers. There's always a writer in his books, because that's his way of writing himself into his books in a way.
Yeah, I feel like Joel Dicker does that too.
Yeah. Well, it's the same thing. I mean, the thing is, a lot of people don't like Joe Hill. I'm making the experience. But I like both Joe Hill and Stephen King. So I was just thinking, like, for my recommendations, if anybody wants to start reading Stephen King, but you're scared because he writes chunk of books, there is a couple of books that are not that long, like The Mist and The Girl Who Killed Tom Gordon, I think it was called. Hold on, I have it somewhere written. The Girl Who Loved Tom Gordon and The Mist are two of the ones that I would recommend, because they're like under 300 pages. So those are very accessible. And I really like the classic I Am Legend, and it's a short book, and it's also horror. So if you're interested in that, it's just basically this guy, he's the last man on Earth. It's kind of like a post-apocalyptic thing, and he's trying to survive, but he's the only one left. So, you know, what's the point? He starts thinking like, what do I do? Because I'm the last person here. So, you know, what are my chances of surviving outside? So yeah, I really like those kind of post-apocalyptic scenarios.
Mm-hmm. Is that the one with the film, I Am Legend?
Yes, I have not
Mm-hmm.
watched the film, but I read the book, and it's fairly short. So, you know, if anybody wants to try something a little bit more post-apocalyptic horror story, that one is also very accessible.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, I'm going to recommend some nonfiction. My favorite at the moment is The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion, and it's basically about the year after her husband died, and he died right in front of her. So this can be pretty triggering. Do look up some triggers for this one, but it's about this year where she knew that he had passed on, but she still kind of had in the idea that at any moment he was going to come back and he was still living. So she's kind of dealing with her grief, living life as normal, but also entirely living life not as normal because she's believing in this idea and concept that he's still always going to come back. So it was very emotional and very interesting to read. And Joan Didion writes really beautifully. And it's for nonfiction, I found it really, really nice, like really readable. So it was quite groundbreaking for me because it was a nonfiction book that I could actually just fall straight in love with. And I also want to recommend my current read for Adultathon, which is Eggshell Skull by Bree Lee. And it's a memoir about her. She's a young lawyer who's kind of interning at the moment, and she gets a lot of sexual assault cases. She lives in Australia, so it's specifically about the legal system in Australia and how sexual assault cases are often not taken seriously, how all this evidence needs to be given, and even though it's law, it's very well explained. And it brings into a lot of question about feminism, intersectional feminism, and as well as that, the author herself had her own sexual assault situation in the past, so it's very triggering for her to be in all these law cases again and again. So yeah, it's quite a lot to handle, lots of trigger warnings again, which I'll talk about more in my wrap up and have down below, but it's really good. I'm not even finished, but I'm still recommending it to everyone because it's really great.
I've literally just while you've been explaining them found them on Amazon and screenshotted it because like both of those books I really want to read now, especially the first one.
I would really recommend them. Do you guys mind if you are on YouTube and are in the chat to type the titles? I think Ola asked if we can.
I saw that and I was going to suggest, I'm going to put mine in the comment, like the main comment underneath the video, just so that then like people don't have to see the chat as well, because I know chats can like disappear. So I'm going to, once this is over, I'm going to put it in the comment section on this video so you can just like refresh the page. My comment will be there. It will tell you the books.
Yeah, we can all do that.
Yeah, I don't read much nonfiction, but I've just got reminded of a nonfiction book that I read. It was kind of like a biography. It was called Brainerd Fire. I don't know if you've heard about it because Netflix also did a movie about it. And it's about this woman that has this mental condition, like it's like a sickness that she has, and she goes kind of mad. And she's telling you her story because it got like really popular, and it's like, it's so scary in a way because our brain is basically what we are. And if that stops working, you know, you are aware that certain things that you're trying to do are not working and that you're changing and you have no control anymore about your mind. It's really scary. And I really love the way that she wrote the book. She wrote it herself as her own story. And yeah, it's called Brain on Fire, My Month of Madness. Like nobody knew what was going on with her. She was at the hospital. Nobody could figure it out what she had. So she kind of wrote her story to try to help also other people that might have the same condition. And doctors might not be able to recognize what they have because she had to struggle so much to find somebody that knew what her problem was. So I really did enjoy that one as well. If somebody's looking for this kind of like more illness kind of nonfiction biography, that one was really good.
I've got some good books here to read now. On my reading list. So thank you guys for both coming and being part of the live show. If you want to mention your just channel name one more time, just for people who joined in late or
cool. No, thank you so much for like creating Adultathon and like asking us to be co-hosts and like doing this because it's a lot of fun. So I'm Jess from Read by Jess, and yeah, you'll see me comment after this anyway, so you can always click on me there.
Mm-hmm.
So thanks, Olivia, for inviting us, and you took my live virginity. It was my first live show.
You never forget your thoughts.
So my channel is Kasha in Bookland, and yeah, I'm also going to leave a comment down below with the book recommendations that I gave, so you can go and follow me there as well. And I hope you guys, even if you just joined and you have not been participating on the Adultathon, you can still do it. You still have a couple weeks. So just start reading some of the books maybe that we mentioned, or other ones that you just came up with while we were talking about books. So you're still in time to join. Yeah.
And there's still time to think of a new name for New Adult. Anyone that does that, save the publishing industry, please.
So thanks so much for joining us, everyone watching, and I hope you have a good afternoon, evening, or if it's like me, morning. Okay, see you.
All right, bye, guys.
Okay.